It says here they've been in turmoil since a revolt against former ruler Saleh, who Washington had long backed as someone to keep militants in check. The new leader of Yemen came to power after a power transfer accord in November brokered by Saudi Arabia and backed by the United States. So this is why I think that they don't like the United States. Why? Because besides providing with military training and material, as well as controversial drone strikes. So this is what I'm getting to. It played an active role in the military offensive earlier this year to remove militants from towns in the South Yemen that occupied during the last year's uprising. So this is what it's all about. Yemeni president ready for talks with Al-Qaeda. We're talking about secession here. He's offered to hold talks with Al-Qaeda militants only if they give up their arms and renounce violence, capitulate, announce their repentance. This is interesting. He added mediators, I wonder who that is, the Saudi Arabia and U.S. pressured me to accept dialogue. And lastly, South Yemen wants secession referendum, says separatist leader from March. This is from March 2011. And what happened was this member, a senior member of the Southern Movement, ran South Yemen until 1990 when it negotiated unification with tribal, more conservative North. So they thought that they were going to get their secession referendum after Saleh fell, but it didn't happen, right? Because they got another puppet in there. So here we go. Unity agreement was based on sharing powers and resources, he said. The experiment has utterly failed. We were fooled. South Yemen is under occupation, and most of our resources are going to the north. Then to China and Asia, expert says China's special forces fighting spirit is stronger, but lack of combat experience. So on August 10th, two experts of the People's Liberation Army of the Military Sciences wrote an article in China's Youth Daily to describe the features of China's special forces and admitted that lack of combat experience, and experiments, that's what it is too, right, is a big disadvantage of Chinese Green Berets. So remember I was talking about how most of these corporations, companies, countries are probably just business. It's just, they're all just basically in cahoots, as they say, right? In the first half of this year, Chinese Special Forces took part in Blue Assault 2012 and Sharp Knife 2012, joint training with the Marine Corps in Thailand and Indonesia Special Forces. So it says here, Sino-Foreign Special Forces joint training has been normalized. So basically until there's just special forces and then there's the terrorists, until eventually the terrorists are people that just want to be left alone. Basically mixing these Islamic extremists, the few minority that are usually backed by the Saudi, Qatar, Zionist, and Western forces or intelligence. They usually back those, but then there's always this kind of separatist group that is legitimate from the grassroots, and then they link them with Al-Qaeda like they did in Yemen. So we're talking about a global, basically special forces used to clamp down on individuals and sovereign states, basically to create this big global empire, global order. Think again, China's military, it's not time to panic yet. From March 2010, I included this because I remember this article. China's armed forces are the biggest in the world. But China's one-child policy generation will weaken its military. So they're talking about recruits. The one-child policy is widely perceived as creating a generation of spoiled, overweight boys dubbed little emperors who are doted on by 4 grandparents while their parents toil to support them in the fields, factories, and offices. It says here that they haven't performed as well in other ways. Only child recruits are not as tough. They don't like to go through the pain of intense training. They call in sick more frequently, and they struggle to perform some simple chores like doing their own laundry. If too much hand-holding is required for these recruits, the PLA could find itself all suited up for modern warfare, but without the soldiers ready to fight it. So here we go. From this 26th of September, ex-generals say this generation is too fat to fight. It says 100 retired generals and admirals concluded a report that being overweight or obese turns out to be the leading medical reason why applicants fail to qualify for military service. Today, otherwise excellent recruits prospects, some of them with generations of sterling military service, are being turned away because they're just too overweight. Then I found this article right here. U.S. students bellyache over new anti-obesity lunches. Students are complaining that they aren't even getting a filling lunch as schools introduce new dietary guidelines aimed at combating obesity among young Americans. The irony, of course, is like if they show it like this, it's, I don't have to go into all the milk and steroids, growth hormones, dead microbes because they pasteurize it. the pear that has pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers on it, this which probably has high fructose corn syrup, food coloring, all sorts of stuff. So it's not even healthy, right? They just want you to look thin. They want you to look, quote, right, bulimic, which is why Lady Gaga was, being bashed by the media. Yes, I am actually sticking up for Lady Gaga here. Dude, it's like when I heard that, I was like, I don't give a flip if she's gained weight. So what? At least she's not a toothpick, right? But that's part of the engineering, right? And the blowback is like Katie Couric coming out and saying, oh, I suffer with bulimia. Well, that's because of the programming. So maybe they're getting people ready for war, right? The future. In suicides, but I don't think it's going to be that because it's going to be machines, right? And cyborgs. In suicide, Army faces steepest challenge. From September 25th, 2012, facing an enemy it can't seem to defeat. It's because it's not the point. It's occupation, exploitation of resources. The Army continues to lose more soldiers to suicide than to combat in Afghanistan, which is why they're doing what? They're experimenting on them even more, right? Military hopes antidepressant nasal spray will prevent suicides. So to prevent the most tragic of outcomes, they're going to give them a nasal spray for suicide. So they're going to give a $3 million grant to what? To the professor at Indiana University. So your tax dollars are going to fund this research, and then it's going to go to like Bayer Pharmaceuticals, and then you're going to pay a lot of money for it, right? And you paid for the The I-Team, the Army's secret Cold War experiments on St. Louisians. I don't even know how you pronounce that, but check out the video. A link will be posted. They uncover details of the Army's ultra-secret military experiments carried out in St. Louis and other cities during the 50s and 60s. Said that they independently verified the spraying of zinc cadmium sulfide in St. Louis on thousands of unsuspecting citizens. That's what I always say. Well, you should suspect. You should be suspecting something like chemtrails, right? I'm suspecting it. So 40 years on the road, when they say, oh, yeah, actually, we were spraying back in the 80s and the 50s and stuff like that with these, quote, chemtrails. Conspiracy theorists were right. Yeah, that's the thing. If you're a suspecting citizen, you're a conspiracy theorist. You should be unsuspecting. Says the study was secretive for a reason. They didn't have volunteers stepping up and saying, yeah, I'll breathe zinc, cadmium, sulfide with radioparticulars. And that's why they have a law. They can do this illegally to test and experiment on the civilian population, so as well as the military. Yeah, in Texas, planes were used to drop the chemical, but in St. Louis, the Army placed chemical sprayers on buildings and station wagons. So the Army can test smoke screens to protect cities from the Russian attack, which is a bunch of bullshit. I was just mentioning this in a comment earlier. The whole Cold War thing. This is a bunch of bullshit. You know how much testing they were doing, how much experiments they were doing after all the technology they got out of that military industrial complex operation? I mean, all that technology that came out of Nazi Germany, they took it out and they just ran with it. And they worked on mind control patsies, super soldiers, all sorts of weapons and stuff like that. And then they just tested on their own populations. It had nothing to do with possible attacks. So they said that they went to great lengths to deceive people.